all of you will agree that the past 24 months have been really hard. You know, if we're really honest, 2020 brought drastic changes to the way we do nearly everything. The way we work, the way we shop, the way we send our kids to school, the way we socialize. But even as we struggled to reach some degree of equilibrium with all of these modifications to our lives, COVID-19 continued to fill 2021 with additional new impacts on multiple levels. Just as we learned more about the microorganism itself, its means of transmission, how it should be treated, etc., it seemed to learn a lot more about us too, and was able to adapt its survival techniques by mutating to more easily transmissible variants. And while we fought to emerge from the initial onslaught of the pandemic and recover from its repercussions to our supply chain, workforce, and economy, the pandemic shifted. And even today, it continues to send us aftershocks of strains with names that sound something like a fraternity and sorority mixer of deltas, gammas, and omicrons. Who came up with that terminology? I'm not sure, but it's kind of funny. But the whole thing has kept us off balance and has added layer upon layer of complications to our decision-making processes in this industry. And none of us, not a single one of us, has been exempt. Each of us, from the youngest toddler to the oldest dawdler, each of us has seen our lives become much more complicated, filled with more questions, and thrust onto what I think of as sort of a merry-go-round of circumstances in a constant state of flux, requiring us to continually adapt. Every decision we make these days is compounded. Even simple things like whether we should go out somewhere. Even simple things like that sends us into a tailspin of 20 questions that we're asking ourselves. Is it safe to go? Should I wear a mask? Will other people be wearing a mask? What are the protocols they have in place when I get there? How do I feel about those protocols? Is it worth the risk? And the list goes on and on and on of these questions we've been asking ourselves for the past couple of years. And even as we seem to be emerging from the worst of the pandemic, I think we still feel the residue in our industry. And that impact is being further exacerbated by the global destabilization created by war in Eastern Europe. COVID-19 energized digital transactions and put omni-commerce on the fast track. You responded, but that solution sprouted new challenges to your delivery systems and cost structures. It spawned new issues in sustaining customer loyalty, and it raised new problems in responding to the increased production questions posed by the electronically empowered shopper. The pandemic took the pre-pandemic experience that life is getting more fast-paced and complex and elevated it to an even higher level than we could have imagined. So perhaps that's one of the key lessons we're meant to learn from our COVID-19 experience. Life is just getting a lot more complicated than it used to be. Now, many of us may be waiting, maybe even yearning for a time when things get simpler, when anxieties lessen, and the decisions we're required to make get a little bit easier than they have been. But I think we have to acknowledge that the ground zero truth that we have to confront and that we have to adapt to is that life and the world in which we live continues to get more complex. And I think this is true biologically, technologically, and anthropologically. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was what many considered a walking contradiction. On the one hand, he was a devout Catholic priest. And on the other hand, he was an award-winning paleontologist. So as a man of science, he was a major proponent of the theory of evolution. Much like an earlier Catholic theologian, Thomas Aquinas, Teilhard's belief was vilified by the church during his lifetime. But his contributions to science, theology, and making sense of what both of those disciplines may teach us about our lives have come to be respected as being way far ahead of its time. At the heart of Teilhard's controversial thought was his recognition that there was a distinct direction to evolution. And the longer Teilhard studied and thought about it and considered this notion, the more convinced he became that evolution's arc was undeniably bent toward increased complexity. He came to realize that when examined over the centuries, no surviving plant or animal evolved into something simpler. If environment or circumstances forced an organism to adapt, it always evolved into something more complex, not something simpler. It just got more complicated, not less so. So over this long arc of evolution, biologically, things are becoming more complex. But we also know that in the short term, developments in manufacturing and technology have made things more complicated. The promise of almost every new device being developed and introduced into our lives was that it would make our lives easier, make it easier for us to live and do the things we need to do. But I think we all have to admit that the reality has been that every labor-saving machine simply doesn't do that. It simply gives us more time to add more stuff into our lives. Time-saving devices have not slowed us down. They've actually sped us up and made us even busier than we were before. And anthropologically, our lives have become more complicated too, in terms of vocations, the arts, travel, and social interactions. I mean, think about it. Once upon a time, almost everyone you knew would have been a farmer. Why? Because in the 1800s, 90% of the US population lived on farms. But today, just 1.3% of the employed US population works on a farm. So in a mere 200 years, farming has moved from being something everyone did to being such a specialty that for many in our society, it's a novelty to even know a farmer. The range of possible vocations has simply become infinitely more varied, more complex. I mean, think about it. What do you all think? Do you agree that life is biologically, technologically, and anthropologically become more complex and complicated? Do you all agree with that? Yeah. And so no matter how much we want to resist the notion, in the end, it's not just our size or strength that's going to shape our future. It'll be our ability to adapt that determines our rate of survival and the capacity to thrive. In fact, if time allowed, we could look at every national crisis we faced in recent memory. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the turbulent 60s, the oil crisis, the Watergate catastrophe of faith in our government, the Great Recession, and the tech boom, and explore the impact each of these milestones had on the American psyche and economy, and the respective repercussions on shopping trends and the changing needs of our customers. In each of these instances, I could review the crisis impact on the food industry, and I could demonstrate how it was those involved in the food industry who paid attention to changes in consumer trends and responded with innovation, resiliency, courage, and customer care. It was you all who carried the day. Across the board, it was not those who resisted the challenges and growing complexities, but those who leaned into them and heeded the impact on shopping styles that were subsequently pushed the industry forward into a new day. Simply put, our heritage is built on innovation and adaptability. And as contradictory as it may sound, I think the best thing we can retain from our past is our penchant to remain focused on the future. The history of commerce is filled with lessons of those who thrived at one point, but became so enamored with doing things the way they'd always done them that they failed to innovate as the world changed around them. They learned the hard way that in an increasingly complex world, adaptability equals success. And if you fail to adapt, you simply will not succeed. This goes for the largest and the smallest businesses and leaders equally, except that it's often easier to turn a small ship than a large one. So yes, the pandemic has tested us, but it's only one in a long line of national challenges we've faced in this country, and only one of the national challenges we're facing at this very moment. As we emerge from the pandemic, we see not only its repercussions, but also some equally challenging changes in our customers, in our businesses, and in our world that are now new and part of our reality. In our most recent FMI Trends research, soon to be published, the level of concern about the pandemic has fallen below the 50% mark for the first time since we started measuring it. We know that Americans are now feeling safer about shopping, about sending their children to school in person, about going out to eat, and even hosting gatherings in their homes. That said, 85% of them say it's still important for stores to continue to enforce COVID-19 safety guidelines for their associates. The chart you see on the screen before you shows that concern levels are falling, but still a third of our shoppers register anxiety about getting ill from other shoppers. A quarter of them are afraid they'll get an illness from store employees, and 1/5 of American consumers are concerned about becoming ill from touching grocery carts and other surfaces in the store, or they're worried that they'll be sick themselves and give it to others if they're out. FMI has been tracking some other consumer concerns about food procurement, and these reveal some really interesting shifts in recent months. Concern that items I need being out of stock started about 2 years ago at 62%. They hit a low last August, but they're now back up at the 45% level. And back when the pandemic started, about 1/3 of shoppers were concerned about prices rising on the foods that I prefer to buy. Now more than half of shoppers register being worried about food prices. And after dipping for a little while, those anxious about having enough money to pay for the food I need is back at the 26% level. The statistic is, of course, very concerning to all of us, as feeding families is at the heart of what the food industry's mission is. So while customer concern about the pandemic itself appears to be dropping, shopper anxiety related to the economic after effects is rising, leaving the food industry with no shortage of new complicated issues to tackle. To address these concerns, we have to remain true to our values of adaptability and innovation. Some of these challenges were brought on directly by the pandemic, but I think it's fair to say that others were simply exacerbated by it. When we asked, you identified the most bothersome of them, which we reported in our Food Retailing Industry Speaks research. Let me quickly name several of them. And as I go through them, please bear in mind that these are the learning fields where change is occurring, and that makes them the most fertile ground for meaningful adaptation and innovation to take place. Perhaps more than ever, the pandemic has pushed supply chain to the forefront of our thinking. It even made it part of our customers' everyday vocabulary. Our customers are talking about the supply chain. This has resulted in many of you taking a hard evaluation of the current state of your supply chain internally in your companies and rethinking the way you engage with your external trading partners. And of course, sitting heavily at the center of the supply chain issue is trucking and transportation capacity, with some 2/3 of retailers saying it's having a negative impact on your business. Now, if there's any place where I think we're susceptible to the overly cautious, but this is the way we've always done it mentality, it's regarding our supply chain mechanics. Over time, we've built an amazingly efficient and complex food supply delivery system in this country. But we must not be afraid to rethink all its moving parts. We have to re-examine it critically from the consumer perspective and apply technological expertise to get the product safely and more efficiently into the hands and mouths of our customers. I think this is going to require a true hard-nosed stem to stern review, all the way from looking at the efficiency of the seed we put in the ground and having a deeper relationship with farmers and the agricultural community, to rethinking where, how, and how much product we produce, deliver, and stock. No detail in the complex system of the supply chain should be above review. And in our quest for supply chain innovation, we must not lose sight of the heightened levels of consumer awareness and expectation regarding sustainability when it comes to packaging, transportation, and storage methods. The pandemic has intensified workforce issues throughout our economy as employees at all levels reassess the nature and meaning of their work. Specifically in the food industry, frontline workers have been lauded as heroes in the face of the pandemic, and deservedly so. But that hasn't solved the long-standing industry challenges with recruitment and retention in our industry. In fact, the past 2 years have seen these struggles amplified. Many of you report pursuing a variety of strategies to resolve these challenges to the tune of $18 billion, including increased wages and benefits, non-monetary benefits and vaccine incentives, flex time and training and skills development, and technology, self-checkout. The list goes on, but I don't think any of us claim to have solved this problem yet. Some are already referring to 2022 as the year of the worker. And in a labor-intensive industry like ours, this clearly is an area that demands our best thinking and our most creative efforts. From research FMI is doing regarding the future of work, we know food industry workers seek higher pay and expanded benefits, more flexibility in their work hours, and clear, real advancement and career opportunities. Now, there's no surprises to any of this, of course, and I'm happy to report many of you are doing very innovative things in these spaces. But industry-wide, we still have work to do when it comes to work culture and the way many hourly wage earners feel they're being viewed and treated by their employers. We have work to do with our managers to ensure they contribute to a positive work environment. And this is an area of focus in our FMI Future Leaders program. Through the work of FMI's supplier diversity and diversity, equity, and inclusion committees, we're working to broaden and enhance our industry's attractiveness across all boundaries. From our supplier diversity survey executed last fall, I'm proud to report that 51% of FMI members report having a supplier diversity program in place, and another 33% are working on developing one. To help facilitate that work, our Supplier Diversity Committee is developing a Supplier Diversity Best Next Practices Guide. FMI's DEI Committee has developed 3 work streams, including one for developing a best practices guide and creating online DEI training modules, another for understanding the role DEI plays in enhancing food industry attractiveness, and a third one for exploring scholarship collaborations. These are all part of a much broader workforce initiative FMI intends to launch later this year. Online shopping. Online shopping was transformed by pandemic necessities, and many of you adapted quickly to meet this trend. A strong majority, at 86%, of food retailers report having online selling capability. And almost all of them, at 95%, saw their online sales dramatically increase in 2020. 8 out of 10 of you report experimenting with your e-commerce strategy. Now, this has long been an area of growth that we anticipated, but as it becomes more woven into the fabric of your customer's way of shopping, we must give deeper thought to the consequences of its execution, economically, logistically, and practically. The rise of the professional shopper, you know who I'm talking about, the individual helping fulfill multiple online orders, has been a much-needed innovation. But in truth, their presence is also affecting the in-store experience of all shoppers. We must seek solutions for both groups, making online order fulfillment more efficient and making in-store shopping more enjoyable. Here, our thinking must not only be outside the box, it must also be beyond the shelf. Another area for the food industry's adaptive energy is its investment, implementation, and experimentation in technology. Some 11% of retailers are currently using micro-fulfillment, and another 15% anticipate doing so. More than a third of retailers are using artificial intelligence in some form, and innovations such as the use of ghost kitchens are receiving noteworthy attention as well. Self-checkout, once an innovation, has turned into a must-do for most retailers. And suppliers are hosting their own websites previously designed for branding and corporate and product information, but now for so much more. While the pandemic had its fair share of negative impacts, it's also had positive influences on consumer behaviors. The uptick in home cooking was perceived by almost everyone at 88% as a positive. This trend, in turn, drove additional attention to meal solutions. And almost 2/3 of food retailers reported that targeting solutions for family meals is an anticipated key means of differentiation from their competition. Some of the related strategies include increased space allocation for fresh, prepared, grab-and-go selections. And some 70% plan to dedicate more space for plant-based foods and meat alternatives. You know, there's just no downside to the food industry doing all it can to support the home cooking trend. It's a win-win for the industry and for your customers. It's proven to be healthier and more economical, and we know from tremendous amounts of research that it reaps countless social benefits. As the level of consumer spend on food away from home begins to edge its way back toward those pre-pandemic levels, we must redouble our efforts to remind shoppers of all the benefits of the family meal eaten at home. I hope you're already making plans for this year's Family Meal Month in September, the biggest and best ever, and that you won't wait until September to make this effort a priority in your company. Additionally, the consumer focus on health and well-being issues has been identified by 77% of you as having a huge positive impact on the industry. The pandemic made health concerns paramount and gave a significant boost, I think, to the food as medicine movement. This elevated concern regarding health also served to bolster registered dietitians' roles as trusted advocates when it comes to helping shoppers execute their health agendas. Our RDs now join doctors, friends, family, and farmers in the top 5 groups consumers consider working for me when it comes to staying healthy. So clearly, those of you playing creatively at the intersection of healthcare and nutrition are going to find it a very important arena for you. And while I'm on the topic of family meals and health and well-being, it would be an appropriate time for me to bring up the issue of mental health. I think it's fair to say that the pandemic, the war in Eastern Europe, economic concerns, and the political divides in our own country are all contributing to high anxiety times for us. This heightened sense of fear and worry can manifest itself in some high-profile, obvious ways, ones we're all too familiar with. Increased outbursts on airplanes, shootings in public places like grocery stores, videoed unpleasant moments in parking lots, and overt incidents of road rage. But there's also the less obvious manifestations. And I think those are really important too. A general decline in civility and courtesy, more stressful workers in our environment, on our teams in our stores, friends with more burdens than they've ever had before, intensified family tensions. These are all really happening to people who are close to us. This year, you'll see our Family Meals program have an added focus on the positive mental health aspect of sharing a meal with loved ones, and you'll hear much more about this issue from our education department in the coming days. In the meantime, I would challenge all of us to be instruments of healing and accord in our world during these difficult times. Randy talked about it earlier. It's important. As an industry with frequent public interactions and one that our communities rely on for daily sustenance, we must be part of the solution, not exacerbators of the problem. That means calling on our highest capacity to consistently be a non-anxious presence when confronted with our customers' anxiety. To quote the sage Paul Simon, we must be a bridge over troubled waters in the lives of those who shop in our stores. We must elevate our teammates and our customers out of the tempest of the times, not further agitate the tide they're in. In many ways, the pandemic gave us a rather startling reminder to stay focused on the needs of the customer. We've already reported how home sheltering drove many to online shopping, but the flip side to that coin is that it pushed the industry to expand renewed energy on enhancing the consumer's in-store experience as well. Among the numerous in-store developments being tried, 83% of responding retailers are focusing on new technologies to improve the customer experience, and 61% on reintroducing and enhancing self-service experience in the stores. After something of a questionable beginning, strategies for scan and go and other mobile payment methods are being revisited in the hope of making the checkout experience more convenient and safer in a pandemic environment. Crises continue to provide a dramatic backdrop for demonstrating just how important the grocer is to the community, and the COVID-19 emergency was no exception. In the wake of the havoc the pandemic wreaked on the entire nation, retailers have placed a high value on acting locally by making community support a priority. This effort is touted among the top service differentiation strategies and was reflected in a strong food industry focus on social responsibility efforts, which took a multitude of directions. Some 90% touted charitable contributions. That 73% reported making diversity in hiring a priority. 70% pointed to their overall diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. 61% highlighted their energy use reduction, and 57% spoke to making food waste reduction commitments. In the thick of realizing shoppers have many options for how and where they choose to spend their food dollars, we must not forget that their choices are frequently determined by the products and stores that most closely share their values. Consumers want to support the food product and food store that helps sustain their community, aligns with their causes, and shares investment in their neighborhood. Consumer research has always been important to the food industry, but it's becoming more necessary than it's ever been before, as the customer demand for being known, respected, and honored continues to increase. Remaining quiet when it comes to sustainability efforts, fair labor practices, animal welfare concerns, and equity issues is no longer an option you have. These are table stakes in today's food retail world. Unless we forget our theme of the arc of evolution bending more toward the complex, among 2021's most complicated challenges was the confounding financial picture the pandemic painted for our industry. Because food retailers experienced significantly higher sales and transaction sizes in 2020 and 2021, but expenses went through the roof, and this phenomenon impacted financial performance for the companies. Retailers made major investments in employee and customer safety, including PPE, cleaning and sanitizing, signage, plexiglass, and the list goes on. And food manufacturers made their fair share of employee safety investments as well. The costs of attracting and retaining employees just rose as retailers and suppliers increased wages, benefits, training, and skills development. As we look to the months ahead when we'll be discussing, probing, and exploring the rising complexities confronting us, there's another tenet to Tayar's thought that I'd like to share with you. In addition to his recognition that evolution undeniably trends toward increased complexity, he also posited that there's a corresponding bent toward greater interconnectivity. He put forward that along evolution's way, while there will be an increase in differentiation and complexity, there also will be a greater understanding of how the complex strands touch, connect, and interrelate. Let me give you an example of rising complexity and interconnection. Our friends at the Hartman Group have been tracking consumer sustainability values for years. In their most recent round of sustainability research, they found that consumer familiarity with the term sustainability has grown steadily in recent years, but that confidence in identifying sustainable products and companies has not. Now, obviously, this highlights an area in which some adaptability growth is desperately needed. But what I want to highlight is this idea that I quote straight from the report, and I quote, "Consumers most engaged with sustainability, those who buy sustainable products and orient behaviors and attitudes around sustainability, are beginning to make connections between issues, developing a system-level view of sustainability more broadly." End quote. Now, there's a lot packed into that statement, but what it means to me is that consumers' consciousness about sustainability grows. They're simultaneously recognizing the complexity of the issue and how it cannot be viewed in isolation. It has to be seen as part of a much larger system. Sustainability awareness is growing in both complexity and connectedness. Now, it may be a gross oversimplification of Tayar's thought, but I see this notion of greater connection as providing the necessary path forward as we strive to stay true to our innovation value and successfully adapt to the world's increased complexity. Clearly, we must remain committed to meaningful connections with our customers so we can accurately anticipate where they're headed. That's part of our heritage that we must forever honor. But successfully navigating our future also requires a better communication and therefore deeper connections among those of us who are active agents in the food supply network. We've said this lots of times before, but our times demand it be repeated with greater urgency. Honest and more straightforward conversation between trading partners on a consistent basis is just a necessity. These candid exchanges will deepen and inform the respective roles that each of us play in the complex realities of our supply chain and our customers. As we become more complex, we must work to enhance our interconnectedness. The increased ties we create will help all of us better understand how a disruption in one area reverberates throughout our supply system. And this, in turn, will enhance a sense of responsibility, not only for our individual roles in the process, but also for how our failures and successes factor into the broader picture. The opportunities FMI has provided for the past 45 years and has continued at this conference are just prologue to the radically candid discussions trading partners must have if together we're to deal with the complexities confronting and challenging our supply chain. We need each other. We just need each other if we're going to recognize and seize the tremendous opportunities we have in front of us. And that leads me to one more challenge from Tayar that I'll leave with you today. He once wrote, "Our duty as men and women is to proceed as if the limits to our ability did not exist. We are collaborators in creation." Innovative thinkers don't think in terms of what can't be done. Instead, they imaginatively play in the sandbox of unlimited possibilities. Let us not be ruled by fear of what could go wrong, but rather courageously drawn by the allure of what could go right if we're working together as we co-collaborate in a new creation. If we can support one another to lean into change, learn from challenges, and adapt our course, then we will be without limits in dealing with all the complexities, forming deeper connections, and together framing a future that fits. Thank you very much.